Well, my full name is Marjorie Dean Esslinger Pendley. I was born in Texaco, New Mexico, 1931, September 14th. We left there when I was 3 months old and come back to Anadarko. And why we come back to Anadarko, I don't know, because there wasn't any relatives there. There was nobody there. They had never been there before. And why they stopped there, I don't know. My parents were Dexter Esslinger and Roba Wade Esslinger. Well, they met in Smithville, Oklahoma, but I don't know exactly how they met. Granny Wade was Anna Lucinda Dodge Wade, and Grandpa was Joseph Columbus Wade, I think. They were from either Missouri or Arkansas, and they lived most of their time in Smithville until they went to Texaco, New Mexico. And they went out there when my parents went out there. Well, Granny Wade, after Granddad passed away, I was only 3 months old when he passed away. He passed away in Texaco, New Mexico. He had pneumonia, and it killed him. And then that's when we moved back to Anadarko. And Granny Wade lived with us until she passed away, really, because Mama was an only child, and so Granny Wade lived with us. And she was just like a mama to me. She took care of me all my life, and I loved her with all my heart. She was 97 when she died, and she died in the Marlow Hospital, because her and Mama had moved down here after Daddy passed away. From Anadarko, they moved to Marlow. And Granny Wade fell and hurt a hip, and Mama had to put her in the nursing home, but she wasn't in there over 2 or 3 months when she passed away, but she was in the hospital with pneumonia. And I was the one that was with her when she passed away. Mildred stayed with her through the week because I worked, and then I would stay with her on the weekends. And she passed away one Sunday morning at 97. So how old would I have been? 35, probably. Granny Wade, like I said, she took care of me, and I slept with her till I was probably 15 years old, and then they bought twin beds, and we slept in the same bedroom, but I slept in a twin bed then. But Granny Wade she was one of the sweetest little old ladies that ever lived. She never said a word to anybody to hurt their feelings, or she was just, everybody loved Granny. Well, there was 9 of us all together, and it was Gladys, Genevieve, Curtis, Kermit, Mildred, John, Herschel, me, Jean. And of my sisters, I was closest to Gladys because Genevieve passed away in Smithville when she was 9 years old. She had typhoid fever, and she died there. And then Curtis was killed in Phoenix, Arizona, when he was 19. And the age difference let's see, Gladys was 17, I believe, years older than me. So she would have been probably 20 years older than Jean. Kerm was the main, he did most of the farming. But when World War II started, he went into the Army. They drafted him. And then, of course, he was sent overseas to the war, and he landed on Normandy Beach, was where he landed. And that's where everything was so bad. And he said when he saw how bad it was, he said, I asked God for his protection. And he said he gave it to me. And then he went on through the war to nearly the end of it. And he was captured by the Germans. And he spent about 6 or 8 months in the German prison camp. And then the war ended. And he got back then with his bunch. And I remember the day he come home. After he got back to the States, the War Department said, we will let you know where he's at and when he'll be home. Well, they never did, and he just pulled up in a taxi one day, and Herschel and Daddy were planting peanuts west of the house there at Washita. And when the taxi pulled up, we were all in the kitchen, Mama and Granny and Mildred and me. And when the taxi pulled up and Kerm got out, Mama just screamed. And Mildred and I jumped in the car and run up to the field where Herschel and Daddy was at, and of course we was just screaming, Kerm's home, Kerm's home. And they jumped off the tractor, and here they come, and we went back down to the house. And of course everybody was so glad that he had made it back, because for a long time we didn't know where he was at. When he first come up missing, I always went to the post office from the school every day at noon and got the mail. And the first that we knew we hadn't heard from him in a while. And I went and picked up the mail that day, and some of the letters that Mama had written him had been returned. And on one of them, they had deceased stamped on there. And the lady that run the post office, I was in probably maybe the 5th or 6th grade. And she said, do you know what deceased means? And I said, no. And she said, it means that he's dead, which she shouldn't have told me that. And anyway, I went back to school. Well, the school got a hold of it, and they took me up to the office, and then they got a hold of, I don't know who come to Washita and picked Jean and I up at the school. I don't remember that. That's when we found out. It wasn't long after that till we got a letter from the War Department, and they said that he had been captured by the Germans and was in a German prison camp. And I have some cards that he sent me from the prison camp. And Mama, I've got one of her letters that he wrote to her from the prison camp. Then he finally made it home. The last we heard, he was on his way, but they said they'd let us know when he arrived in the United States and when he would be allowed to come home, because he had to go through a bunch of stuff to be safe to come home. Well, when they captured him, he said there was several of them in they called it let's see, what did they call it? It was a trench that they had dug, and they'd put doors on them somehow. And he said there was 3 or 4 of them at one end of it and 3 or 4 at the other end. Well, at the other end, it killed all of them when they shot it with, dropped a bomb on it or shot it up or something. And those 4 were killed. But the ones on the other end, Kerm said it just knocked them all out. And when he come to, he said a German guard had his gun pointed right at him, and they figured they'd kill him, but they didn't. And he said when they started asking them their names, he said Kermit Esslinger, and of course you don't get any more German than Kermit or Esslinger, either one. And they told him he was fighting on the wrong side. And he said he thought they would shoot him again for his name being Esslinger. There's a lot of Esslingers in Germany. They didn't, and he said the guards that guarded him, he said they weren't mean to him. He said unless they got to making too much fuss, and he said they did take 1 or 2 out and shoot them at different times when they got uncontrollable. But Kerm said they never did. He said they nearly starved to death because there wasn't any food. But he said if there was food, he said the guards shared it with them. But he said a lot of times it had maggots in it. But he said we got so hungry, he said we would eat anything they put out there. And when when the war was ended, they was marching them from one camp to another because the Russians were coming. The Russians at that time were on our side, and the Russians were coming from one way, and the U.S. was coming from another way, and they knew that one of them was going to get them, and they kept marching them back and forth. And Kerm said they come to this farm, and all those German farms, he said, had big, large barns because they were all farmers. And he said they stopped at this place that had this large barn, and said the guy that was the leader of the group, he told the farmer they were going to sleep in the barn that night, and he didn't want them to. He wanted them to go on. And he said, no, we're going to sleep there. And there was a patch of turnips out behind the barn, he said. And he told him, he said, and we're going to eat all of those turnips we want to. Kerm said they ate turnips till they nearly got sick. But that's where they spent the night. And then he said the next morning, he said the lady of the house started making biscuits and gravy for them. And she fed them before they left. And he said they'd bring big old pans of biscuits out there and a big old bowl of gravy. And he said, boy, he said, you think that wasn't good. He said, we ate biscuits and gravy till we were so full because he said we didn't know when we would get anything else to eat. And but the Russians were the ones that got to them first. And they recaptured them, and then they sent them back then to the U.S. base where they needed to be. Curtis was killed when he was 19 in Arizona, and of course this was during the Depression, and there wasn't any jobs and there wasn't any money. Everybody was poor. And Curtis and his wife was only 13. Curtis was 19, she was 13. And her brother, I think, had gone out there and was pulling cotton. And so Curtis and they called her Sis. They went out there. And she said one night he sat down and was writing Mom and Daddy a letter. And this guy that run that, he hadn't been paying them. And some of them had gone to his office there, and they just kind of lived in little huts around there. And a bunch of them had gone to the office to see about getting paid. And it started this fight. And she said Curtis got up to go out there, and she said she begged him not to go, but he wanted to see what was going on. And she said he got about halfway to the house where they were at, and he heard the gunfire. So he turned around and started back to their little shack, and they shot him in the back. And some guy in a pickup pulled up, and she had run out there. And she said they got him in the pickup, and he was still alive at the time, but he died before they got him into the hospital. So that's his story. John was in the Navy. He was on a submarine, and he told me one time how sick he got when they first put him on that submarine. And he said it went down, and they stayed underwater for several months at a time. And he said, I was never so sick in all my life as I was. He said, I'd lay there, and he said finally they told him when he got over it, then he'd be okay. And he said he was. He said he was sick for several days, and then he come out of it, and he was all right. So he made it back good. And Herschel was in the Navy, but he got in right at the end of the war, so he never did get into any of the battles or anything. Well, Gladys, after we moved to Washita, she went into Anadarko and got a job at this man and lady's house, keeping house for them. And she met Bruce, and Bruce's dad was a farmer. And Bruce and his brothers all played instruments, and they played for dances. Gladys would go to the dances with them, but Bruce wouldn't let her dance with anybody because he was jealous of her. He was a good guy. I like Bruce. And she was one of Granny Wade's favorites too, because she was the oldest, and she stayed with them a lot when she was young. The boys, we lived close to the Washita River, and the boys, they had a place down there where they went swimming all the time, and they put a rope in a tree where they could swing out over the river and drop off in it. But Mama wouldn't let Jean and I go swimming. She said until we learned how to swim, we couldn't go swimming. So we couldn't go swimming. But Mildred was down there with them one day, and she wanted to learn how to swim. And Kerm just took her out in the middle of the river and turned her loose and told her to get back to shore. So she had to swim back to shore. But he wouldn't take us out there. It was hard work. Daddy and the boys, they worked hard, and we had several cows that they milked, and that's how we bought groceries. We separated the milk and got the cream, and every Saturday Daddy would go to town, and we had chickens. And sometimes he'd have several dozen eggs left over that we hadn't used. And he'd take eggs and the cream to the grocery store. They bought it there at the grocery store. And he'd trade that for groceries. And then he raised a big garden in the summertime. And Mama and Daddy and Granny they'd can all summer, and if they hadn't, we wouldn't have had anything to eat in the wintertime. But that's what we had was, and Daddy and Bruce and Otis, Mildred's husband, they always butchered hogs. And Daddy fixed a bin out in the barn and made this box, and I don't know how they made it that would keep the hog meat, but we had pork nearly all the time. They made sausage and of course we had ham and bacon, and we nearly always had pork, but never any beef because they couldn't butcher them. It was tough because we lived all through the Depression, yes. Mama was the one that did the spankings. Daddy never did. And about once a month, she thought she had to give Jean a dose of castor oil. And Jean would always run from her. And one time, Mama chased her all over the farm trying to catch her to make her take it, and she never did catch her. But I played basketball and I played softball. And I love basketball. And I played, at that time, you played either guard or forward. And there was 6 to a team. You played 3 on each end, 3 guards and 3 forwards. And I played guard unless one of the forwards wasn't there. And if one of the forwards wasn't there, then I had to move to forward, but I didn't like playing forward, and I wasn't a good forward because I couldn't hit the basket. But my best friend was Wilma Cossey, and she lived west of Washita, and we lived south, east of Washita. And the railroad track run down below our house. And Wilma and I was always walking back and forth, either to her house or my house. And Wilma's mother, she was more strict than Mama was. And one day we'd walk to her house, and the people that lived down the road, they had a bunch of watermelons, and they'd put some on the truck and was taking them into Anadarko to sell them. And, of course, they knew Wilma real well, and they asked us if we wanted a watermelon. We said, sure. So they give us a watermelon. Well, we went carrying that watermelon into the house, at Wilma's house, and her mother said, where'd you girls get that watermelon? And Wilma told her who gave it to us. She said, now, if you stole that melon, you can just take it right back. You're not going to eat it here in my house. But we hadn't stole it, so she finally let us eat it after we talked to her. And we had a lot of fun. One asked me one day, he was a new one, he'd come to school there. Of course, you know, when a new girl or guy comes in, all the boys or girls, one just goes nuts over him. And I just thought he was the cutest thing. And we were sitting in class one day, and he passed a note to me and asked me, he said, would you be my girlfriend? Well, that just turned me off. I didn't like him anymore. I did. And he lives in Duncan, Oklahoma right now. I've seen him several times. In fact, him and his wife come to church down here a few times. It was the first time I saw him that I knew who he was. Those little country schools like that. But when I finished the 11th, that's when they closed the high school down. Some went to Anadarko, some went to Gracemont, some went to Fort Cobb. And of course, where I lived, I had to go to Anadarko, and so did Wilma. And we were the only 2 out of that whole class that went to Anadarko. And oh, I hated Anadarko. But I started in the 12th grade, and Daddy, he bought all those expensive books, and one day I met Wilma coming down the hall, and she had all of her books in her hand, and I said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "I'm going home." She said, "I've had all this I can take." And I said, "Well, if you are, I am." So I went and got all my books and carried them home, and I took them in the house, and Daddy said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm quitting." And he said, "No, you're not." And he really got on to me, and he talked to me for 2 or 3 days trying to get me to go back, because in Smithville, Daddy went to a business school for a while before him and Mama got married. So he believed in education. He would have liked for every one of us to have had an education, but I didn't like Anadarko, so I wouldn't go back. Oh, I worked at TCNY, Elmer Edward Pendley, and on Saturday night he'd send one of the girls that lived down there where he lived to see if I'd go to the movie with him. And I did a time or two, and then one Saturday night she come in there and she said, "Elmer wants to know if you'll go to the show with him." And I said, "If Elmer wants me to go, he'll have to come in and ask me himself." So, so he did, finally. He was shy. He lived we both lived in Anadarko at that time, because they had sold the farm and bought this little house in Anadarko. Well, when we first met, we were 17, and I'm 8 months older than he is. And we met at a weenie roast. And I didn't even want to go to the weenie roast. Jean was going, and some of the girls that lived around out there. And I didn't have anything else to do that night, so I decided, well, I'd just go. So I did. Well, that's where I met him, was at the weenie roast. He said, "Mom and Daddy, your granny couldn't throw water out the back door without throwing it on him," said he was always out there. Well, he had gone to work in the oil field and was working at Anson, Texas. And his uncle and his wife, Elgin and Frances, she had gone out there, and Elgin had a little apartment, and she was staying there with him. And I took a week's vacation, and Elmer wanted me to go out and stay with Frances for a day or two, so I did. When I went back home, well, then he kept on until we finally got married. And we got married in Anson, Texas by a justice of the peace. That was our wedding. And Elmer's dad had been working there, but they'd sent him someplace else. And I could sign because we were both 18. But he had to be 21, and I could be 18, so I signed. But Elgin had to sign Ott's name for Elmer because he wasn't of age. And I always told him we weren't even married because Elgin had to sign. 70 years. We was married 70 years in July, and he passed away in September. Papa liked to go to the pool hall. Sometimes I'd go up there and get him out. He was pretty ornery about the pool hall. Every evening when he come in from work, he thought he had to go to the pool hall. And then after we moved down here to Marlow, he had kind of quit up there. Well, he had quit. He got tired of me coming in there and getting him. So he quit going. But then after we moved down here to Marlow, John Underwood that he worked with, and they were good friends, and John played dominoes. Well, there was a domino place uptown, so John got to going up there every evening and playing dominoes. Well, Elmer started going with him. And they'd stay till 8 or 9, 10 o'clock. So I told Elmer one day, I said, Daddy was sick when we moved to Marlow. He had had a stroke. And he begged me not to come. He told me one day, he said, I'll give you $1,000 a month if you'll stay up here with me. And he didn't have $1,000 to his name. And but I would go back up there every week and sometimes twice a week. But then I finally told Elmer, I said, if you're going to go to the pool hall every evening, I'm going to move back to Anadarko. Of course, he didn't think I would. And I'd save supper for him. I'd go ahead and cook supper, and I'd save his supper. And then one evening I thought, I'm just going to feed that to the dogs. I'm not going to save it for him. He can just... So when he come in, he wanted to know where supper was at. And I said, the dogs ate it. He got mad about that and had a little fit. I said, I'm not going to stay down here now and you going to the pool hall. You'll either quit or I'm going back to Anadarko. But I kept throwing supper away. I wouldn't save it for him. He'd get mad about that every evening. And finally he quit. And Alice never did make John quit. I don't know why. He went up there. She might have been glad to got rid of him. I don't know. But, well, I wasn't working when we first moved to Marlow. And we come down here with the rig that he'd been working on up to Anadarko. They moved it down here to Marlow. And so that's how come us to move to Marlow. And then when the rig left here, it went to, I think, Mississippi. And we didn't go, and there was about 4 or 5 other families that didn't go, that everybody stayed here. And then I decided I wanted to go to work. So I went to beauty school, went up to Chickasha and went to cosmetology school. And then I put in a shop, and that's what I did after we moved down here. They were both born in Anadarko. Dr. Cook delivered both of them. And Blaine was born in 51, in May of 51. Ann was born in 52. They fought all their lives. One day they were probably 6 or 7, 8 or 9, somewhere along in there. And she got after him with a croquet mallet. And every time he'd pass the front door, he'd holler, "Mama!" But he couldn't get far enough ahead of her to get in the house because he knew she'd hit him if she could get close enough. I finally went out there and made her leave him alone. Blaine always played. He played baseball when he was little for a year or two, and he didn't like baseball. But then he loved basketball, and he played basketball. He was a good basketball player. He played football. He was a fair football player. He started on both teams. He loved sport. Of course, we went to every game he was ever in. And then Ann played basketball, but she wasn't very good at it because she was smaller than most of them was. She really didn't care that much about it. She played, but... Well, I remember the day she was born, and born down in Duncan, Oklahoma. And, of course, we were down there. And when they brought her back and put her in the nursery, they said Elmer and Norman's nose print was on the window, standing there looking in. She lived with us a lot, and that's where I wanted her. She was born in, 1969. She played sports. She was a good basketball player. Her and Shelley, they could block them. They'd back them clear off the court. And finally a referee told him one night, said, "You girls can't do that now." He said, "You're going to have to stop that." Because they'd put their hindies into them and just keep backing them until they didn't have anywhere to go. But they were good players. Fun to watch them. And she run track. No, she didn't run track. She threw the discus. She won state in discus when she was a junior. She was good at that. And the next year she could have won it, but she stepped on the line. I told that ref, I said, "You didn't have to call that." I said, "Her foot wasn't even really on the line," which it really was. Her toes were, but he didn't have to call it. But, well, we went to Branson and took her with us, and on the way home, we was driving El Camino. Well, she had gotten the back and made her a bed back there, and she slept all the way home in the back of that El Camino until we got to Chickasha. And just about the time we was pulling into Chickasha, there was this place up there, and he sold those little Yamahas. And one or two of the kids already had one. And he said, "Have you got any money left?" And I said, "Yeah, a little bit." And he said, "How much you got?" And I counted it, and he counted his, and he said, "I think we got enough to buy her one." He said, "Let's stop and get her a Yamaha." And I said, "Okay." So he stopped the pickup and had her to get up front with us, and she got up there, and we went in and bought this Yamaha, and we lived across the street from the middle school, and well, they wouldn't let them park the Yamahas over at the middle school because they didn't want them driving them to school for some reason. So they got to parking them in our backyard. We'd just leave the gate open, and they'd pull around there. Well, the police called me one day. He wanted to know if I would make the kids stop parking their Yamahas back there. And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, we don't want them driving them to school." And I said, "Why do you not want them driving them to school?" And he said, "We're afraid they'll get hurt." And I said, "That's the only way some of those kids have getting to school." And I said, "No, I'm not going to make them stop parking their bikes in the backyard." I said, "They can park them back there anytime they want to." Well, every time Renee and Shelley would get out and start riding them, the police would get after them, and they'd chase them home. And Shelley and Renee, boy, here they'd come on those bikes, and they'd hit that backyard. And I called him one day, and I said, "You better leave those girls alone." I said, "Now, you're going to cause them to have a wreck." And I said, "What do you think we bought those for? We didn't buy them to sit. They're supposed to be riding them." And I said, "What about that one that she drives the pickup all over town, and she doesn't have a license, but her dad's on the police force?" I said, "What are you going to do about that?" "Well, we're going to put a stop to it," but they never did. They finally decided they was going to have to leave the girls alone because they couldn't make me do what they wanted me to. So, and Renee rode hers till the little old bike was just wore completely out. The one thing that had him so upset was after her boyfriend Sean Mackey went to college up at Oklahoma State, and he went on a football scholarship. And one weekend, her and Shelley, they went up there and they didn't tell anybody. Shelley told her folks Renee was staying over at our house with Renee, and Renee told us she was staying out at Shelley's house. Well, on Sunday afternoon, Glenda Mackey called, and I think she knew what she was doing. And she called and wanted to talk to Renee, and I said, she's not here, she's out at Newberry's. So in a little bit she called back and she said, those girls are not out there. She said, Kay said they'd stayed at your house. And Elmer and Kay both just went wild. Elmer said, yeah, he said they probably started home last night and had a flat or something. Said, no telling what's happened to them. And Kay, she was still on the phone and she was having her a fit. Well, they think they can whip a bear when both of them are together. Finally, I told them, I said, would y'all please shut up and get off this phone? And I said, Elmer, he said, I'm going to take the keys away from her when she gets home. We found out, Glenda called back up there, and we found out that they were on their way home. She finally got a hold of Sean, and he said, they're on their way home. And so she called me and told me they were on their way home. Elmer said, I'm taking her keys away from her. He said, I'm going to keep them for a week. Well, I knew he wasn't going to take her keys away from her. And but when she come in, he held out his hand and she dropped the keys over in there. And he kept them for probably 5 minutes, wasn't it? And then he handed them back to her. And he wasn't going to keep those keys. When the car that we had bought her when she went to college, it got to where it would die on her when she'd be out driving it. Well, Elmer had a cousin up there that run a little garage, and Howard would go get her car and bring it in, and he'd work on it, and he never could find out what was wrong with it. And the football coach told him one day when they were drinking coffee, he said, I'll tell you how you can solve that problem. And Elmer said, how's that? And he said, go buy her a new one. And so we talked that over, and he decided, well, that's probably what he'd better do. So one evening they was talking about it, and he just got up and walked out the house, and I knew that's where he was going, but there was a car lot here in town then. And I told her, I said, you better go out there. I said, he's going out there to get you a car. If you want anything to say about it, you better go out there. So she took off out there. Well, she picked out the one she wanted, and she got a Beretta. It was a pretty little car. Brand new. I was working out at the AOA plant, and Kay come by one day, and she was the manager out there. And she said, well, I see you're going to have to work at least 3 more years. And I said, yeah, I am. I said, don't fire me now, 'cause I got to work, baby. She said, I'll let you work 3 more years. One evening I was coming in from work, and I saw the police there at the house, and I thought, my word, what's going on? And I got on down there. Well, she had locked her keys up in the car, and they come down there and was trying to help her get her keys out of the car, but they finally got them out. And, oh, I thought I was going to die when they left here. We was standing out in the yard when they backed out and left, and I think I cried all day and all night, and she did too. And Pat asked her why she was crying, and she said because she had never been away from us. And then after he quit out there and come back, they stayed out here for a while, and they slept in the south bedroom. And Bo, he was a little bitty guy. He'd come and get in bed with us, and he'd say he'd go to sleep with us, and he'd get in bed with us. He'd lay there for a few minutes, and then he'd decide he wanted to go to bed with his mama, and he'd get up. And he'd make 3 or 4 trips sometimes before he'd decide, and he'd always wind up with his mama. He was a cutie. And then along comes Mia. She was born in the Duncan Hospital. And I remember Renee called me that morning and told me she was going down there. And I didn't want to be there when she was born, because I didn't want to see her go through all that pain. And I kept fooling around there in the kitchen, and I was just getting ready to walk out the door, and Lacey called me. She said, "Where are you at?" And I said, "Well, I'm just leaving." And she said, "Well, you're too late." She said, "She's already here." She was a little doll. Yeah, Renee taught in Duncan, and she'd bring you kids out here. And I'd always have biscuits and gravy made for you every morning. I'd take you to school and take Bo to school. And, of course, you weren't going yet. We'd get within about a block or two of school, and he'd say, "Grammy, my stomach hurts." And I knew it didn't, but I felt sorry for him because he was real timid when he first started school. I wanted to bring him home so bad, I'd think. And then I'd think, well, I can't do that. I've got to take him to school. And I'd say, well, let's go ahead and go to school, and if it don't quit hurting, I'll tell her to call me and I'll come and get you. I knew if I could ever get him in there, he'd be okay. But he never did call me after he got in there. And then he started playing t-ball. Of course, we loved watching him play t-ball. He was a good baseball player. He won the first game in high school that Marlowe had ever won in a state tournament. And when the coach stopped and he was looking to see who he was going to put in because he had pulled that pitcher out, he wasn't doing any good. I thought, Lord, please don't let him put Bo in. And then he put Bo in, and I thought, Lord, please let him do good. And he did. He got him out. We won. And the first pitcher he had put in there, that he run out and grabbed Bo and hugged him, and he was thrilled to death that we had won. And then Mia, she starts playing t-ball. And one day we was out there, and at home when she would be playing with the boys, she'd get up there and she'd hit that thing and she could knock it a mile. And when she was playing out there with the little kids, she'd get up there and just kind of peck it out in front of her. And she got up to bat one day, and we were behind, I think it was 3 points, wasn't it? And she got up to bat, and I had been to Duncan that day, and I'd bought her a new pair of flip-flops. We was sitting right behind where she was standing, and I walked up there where she was at, and I said, "Mia, if you'll hit a home run," I said, "we'll win that game." And I said, "Get up there now and hit it just hard as you can hit it." And I said, "I bought you a new pair of flip-flops today." I said, "I'll give them to you after the game." She said, "What do they look like?" And I said, "Well, they're real cute. They've got flowers across the top of them." And I said, "Now you just get up there and hit that ball just hard as you can hit it." And she got up there, and boy, I mean, she whacked that ball, and it just rolled and rolled and rolled, and we won the game. And then she wound up a good softball player, a good basketball player. She went to college on a scholarship the first year in softball, and now she's got a master's degree, and she likes to mow yards. Her mama said there she is with a master's degree out there mowing yards. They always liked to go pumping with him, and Elmer loved to take them, and he would always tell that Bo would sit up on that deal between the seats and have one arm around his shoulder, and he loved for him to go. And then Mia, when she got big enough to go, she'd have to go to the bathroom, and he'd hold her up somehow on the back of the pickup. I don't know how he did it. And he'd say, "Now let's wipe your twat." You and Macy nearly broke me in Hibbett's 2 or 3 times. Y'all just kept gathering up stuff. And I just went ahead and paid for all of it, just like I was supposed to. She had so many dolls, and we would go to Walmart a time or two a week. And one day I told her when we started in, I said, "Now we're not going to buy any dolls today, because," I said, "your mom said you had too many and to quit buying dolls." And I said, "She's going to get us if we buy any more dolls." And so we got to the door, and she said, "Grammy, can I just go look at them?" And she didn't even wait for me to answer. She just took off. She knew where that doll aisle was. And here she went. And I finally caught up with her, and she'd walk up and down that aisle, and walk up and down, and finally she'd see one, and she'd say, "Can I have this one, Grammy? It just cost," and she'd see how much it cost. Of course, she'd always come home with another doll, and she's probably got at least 100. Swayze plays with them, the little greats. Swayze likes them about as good as Mia did. And that's what I buy her and May every year for Christmas, is the doll. Renee was up there one day last year after Christmas, and Swayze had both dolls playing with them. And Renee said, she said, "Are you playing with May's doll?" And she said, "No, that's mine." Renee said, "I thought Grandma bought that one for May." And she said, "I'll give her one. I'm going to keep that one." So I don't know how that turned out. But she won't be able to put stuff over May very much longer, because she's going to get big enough that she's going to hold her own with her. When we would come out of Walmart, Brahms was right across the street. And we'd always go there to get us an ice cream cone. And we'd go in, and she'd start looking, and she'd always wind up with, was it orange sherbet? And I'd get vanilla or chocolate, whatever I wanted. We'd get in the car and start home, and we wouldn't get a block down from Brahms. And she'd say, "Grandma, let me taste of yours, and I'll let you taste of mine." So I'd hand her my cone. She'd taste of it, and she'd say, "You want to trade?" So I'd trade with her, and this went on and on for several weeks, trading ice cream cones. And one day we went in to get us one, and she started looking, and I said, "You better get something besides that orange sherbet, because I don't like it, and I'm not going to eat it, and I'm not going to trade with you today." So she changed her mind real quick and got some other kind of ice cream. And so we didn't have to trade that day. Bo has his little family now. He's got 2 sweet little girls. And Swayze Jane, I think Mia named Swayze. May, is that? Yeah. And she's a little doll too. And she's, Swayze's never still 1 minute. Mara, she's a little solemn. She's gonna be a dandy. And they live in Mustang. Swayze started pre-K this year. She loves it, of course. She's 4. May's 1. They're my great-greats, and I'm 94. One time when Bo was playing baseball, he called the house that day, and he needed $200 because he had broke the TV. he accidentally let his bat slip out of his hand and hit the TV and broke it, and the coach was going to make him pay $200 for it. So he called the house, and Mia answered the phone, and she said, Bo needs $200 to pay for a phone. He wants to know if you'll let him have it. And I said, no, because he was probably jacking around and he shouldn't have broke the TV. And she told him, and they hung up, and then I got thinking about it, and I thought, I can't let him do that. So I told Mia, I said, call him and tell him to come get it. So she called him and told him he come got the 200 and paid for the TV. I remember the first TV we bought. It was in a cabinet. That's why they started out making them, putting them in a cabinet. And this little old TV, it didn't have much of a picture on it, but I mean, that's when they first started making them. And then, of course, TV just kept getting better and better, and I was probably maybe 22 or 3 when we got our first TV. Well, I guess I got my first iPhone when I was about 80. Well, I think I've got the best family there is. The main thing I want my family to do is to serve the Lord, make heaven. Worst part of our life that I can think of is when Elmer got this dementia. And at first we didn't really know what it was, you know, and he just kept getting worse and worse, and he knew something was wrong. And he would ask me, what's wrong with me? And I'd say, I didn't want him to know that he had dementia, and I'd say, well, we're just getting old. And he'd say, no, there's something wrong. And he had had open heart surgery, and he kind of blamed it on to the anesthetic. He thought maybe that's what had messed his brain up. And it might have had something to do with it, I don't know. But, of course, it just kept getting worse and worse. And then finally, the Lord took him home. He had got to the point we were going to have to do something. And I'm glad that the Lord took him home before he got any worse than he did. He's been gone over 5 years now, and we still miss him just like we did the day he left. But we'll all be there one of these days.